Hey hairline, frontal recession here. In the interest of full disclosure and disclaimer, I should tell you that I was a little too excited about recording this episode and I may not have made as many valid points as I thought I was going to. But I am proud of the content that I was able to put together for this episode, so I hope you enjoy it. But I have to tell you, it goes into like some Captain Obvious stuff when it comes to the entire overarching theme and message of it. And in a Black Mirror way, not in a much better way. Not to say Black Mirror is horrible, that's not what I mean. What I mean to say is it goes into internet content creator cliche territory, which is not a new territory on this podcast, let's be fair. But it's just something I want to give you a fair warning about before you enter the podcast. So now you've been warned, and I can cue the fucking. On October 21 of 2015, an important pop culture moment arrived. We were experiencing in real time, in present tense, the day on which Doc and Marty from the popular franchise of Back to the Future, specifically the movie Back to the Future 2, visited their future from 1985, 30 years ahead of time. Which means as of October 21, 2015, the entire franchise under the label of Back to the Future was in the past tense. And to be fair, if you're just shrugging your shoulders and assuming that that's not as important and factored as I'm making it out to be, I can't blame you because it's not the first time that's happened. 2001 A Space Odyssey did it before it was cool. The movie was made in 1968 and arguably has not aged a day since then, thanks to Stanley Kubrick, who was behind the project. But more importantly, it predicted the future of human race in 2001. That was the year that they dated. And that year has been in the past for about 19 years as of today. Of course, I'm certain that there are other pieces of science fiction that actually predict years that have already passed. But I would assume that these are examples that my audience would be familiar with because all of you seem to be cultured individuals. And these are difficult to miss, if not essentials of culture. The secondary reason I bring these movies up is because it sort of provides us with an appraisal meeting on these dates or on these years as to have we achieved what us as a civilization imagined ourselves to be doing at certain points in time. Of course, as most people who've recently graduated out of college or have had their college dreams fallen apart in front of them recently would know, these appraisal meetings, when you do them with yourself, don't really go that well. Like, you would hope your podcast would be doing really well by now, but like you're still struggling to get 1,000 subscribers. There's no relation to me here. I'm not inserting myself here. But jokes aside, let's understand what expectations these specific movies have put forward for us. For example, 2001 A Space Odyssey expects us to be excavating monoliths on the moon. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but we did find a monolith on Utah, which is not half bad, it's halfway there. And we were expected to create an AI which was self-aware enough to kill us in the process of protecting itself from us. Also, not to mention, we were also supposed to make a manned mission to Jupiter by this time, or at least have the technological capability to do it. The good news on that front is at least we have the capability to not only make unmanned journeys to all of these planets, but also go to interstellar space. In Back to the Future 2, they already have self-driving clothes and hoverboards along with flying cars, and we're getting there. At least the hoverboards were real. And if not, at least we have the comfort in the part that there are soulless amounts of sequels to every movie and holograms are actually pretty decent these days. So that's a win, right? But these are expectations about technological advancements that I myself have not contributed to or have the capability of contributing to. So I am certain at some point human civilization will reach these goals eventually. Because we've done them in other cases. For example, Arthur C. Clarke, the gentleman who was an author on 2001 A Space Odyssey, actually predicted that geostationary satellites will be an important part of our communication, which essentially actually hardware-wise support most of our internet today. And if you want a more pop culture reference, then like, for example, Star Trek and the flip phones. But what really got my goat and what really got me thinking about these movies and this specific issue that we're talking about today is that while authors who were writing about this stuff had the benefit of leaving the building of aesthetic to the reader himself. For example, when I read something like Minority Report, a short story written by Philip K. Dick, which eventually went on to be a really good movie and then a really bad movie. I have the benefit of imagining that from the written word to the entire living spatial aspect of it. But when it comes to the visual dimension of telling a story set in the future, for example, 2001 A Space Odyssey or Back to the Future 2 or Alien or even games that have come out today, they very literally need to capture what technology of the future looks like. And I was talking to somebody who was not familiar with the concept that we're talking about here today, but they told me the moment they heard the word that we're talking about today, which is the title of the episode, Retrofuturism, they understood exactly what it means. And most of what we understand about the aesthetic of the retrofuturism comes from this technological limitation between what the artist had at the time that they're creating the movie and what they want to represent of the time that they are creating the story of the movie in. And quite simply put, retrofuturism hence becomes the vision of the future from the past. The term retrofuturism was not a word until an American film critic by the name Pauline Kael coined the term to describe jewelry that was being sold in the Bloomingdale catalog. Eventually, it came to describe aesthetic of futuristic visions in the past. For example, 2001 A Space Odyssey or Alien, both of whom are excellent examples of what the future looked like in the past. And the primary way I started to identify what retrofuturism is aesthetic wise is monochrome monitors and cathode ray tube monitors with giant boxes being used in the years as far distant as 2137. Of course, I mean 2137 in the story that is being told, not 2137 the year, because I haven't seen that kind of time. And I have to admit to being a little cheeky, because the reason I started thinking about retrofuturism is because me and my friends have been playing this game called Alien Isolation, and all of my friends would testify I am terrible at it. But my terrible gaming skills aside, what all of us happen to notice is the sheer commitment of the creative team to help us have the most authentic 1979 Alien experience possible. And how they achieved that is they actually went back and got their hands on about 3 terabytes of actual movie footage and making footage, like about 3 terabytes of it that Ridley Scott just happened to have lying around. And they decided that within game aesthetic will be created just like the set designer had intended. Ron Cobb, who is something of a visionary when it comes to creating the aesthetic that is known as retrofuturism as of today, created something called the semiotic standard, which sort of defines the retrofuturistic aesthetic in terms or in frame of reference of the Alien franchise. These big clunky boxes for machines along with key cards everywhere, and literally an entire glossary of icons for things that were imagined to be involved in space travel at the time was created by this man for a movie, and it set the standard for how retrofuturism would look like. Of course, retrofuturism as an entire branch of aesthetic is not defined by this movie or by this one designer, but he did create a subgenre which was very impactful and a very present voice in understanding how it looks or what it conveys. This specific aesthetic and everything that looks like it or aligns with it by time is called cassette futurism, because it is futurism according to the age of cassettes, which is the 80s. And at this time, it was inconceivable to the people who were trying to build a future that was aesthetically futuristic that data could be stored in anything smaller than a cassette. And hence, cassettes, monochrome monitors, and cathode ray tube monitors or displays, along with very specific sharp aesthetic of fonts, were associated with retrofuturism for a very long time. And any sophistication in the terms of visuals of a monitor or a screen that displays information was denied to it. And the reason is simple, is because the designers and the directors needed these experiences to look alien and futuristic. They needed to look like predecessors of technology that they see already for the audience to understand a frame of reference. Another place where our frame of reference for retrofuturism was created was the classic anime Akira. Of course, the same clunky keyboards that made noise along with monochrome monitors that showed data were all around surrounding the characters, but also there were graphs which were three-dimensional and holograms everywhere, and the cities looked overcrowded with concrete everywhere. This built upon what was already known about the retrofuturistic aesthetic, but also it added the hyper urbanization that Japan was experiencing at the time. And I have to be honest with you, I do not come up with this information on my own altogether. I learned most of what I told you in the last 3 minutes from a YouTuber called Kernatron, and it really breaks my heart to see how many subscribers he has. So please go show support to this YouTuber. The link is down in the description. The video is brilliant. Please go watch the video as well. It will give you more information about retrofuturism in itself. But I wasn't done reading about retrofuturism just yet. For better or the worse, time sort of moves on. That's one of the things it is known for, not stopping for anybody. And what that means is every prediction that we make for the future and pen it down in terms of visual aesthetic will count as retrofuturism at some date, which means retrofuturism as an aesthetic family has to evolve into something that we don't understand or don't know. And I sort of found the perfect answer to that question, that retrofuturism is a nascent baby of imagining a technocratic world ahead. And the edgier teenage version of that was cyberpunk. And it is not a coincidence that cyberpunk comes out in 12 days. I definitely timed this accordingly. And cyberpunk as an aesthetic was not actually all that far from cassette futurism. It just involved a lot sharper features, and it strayed further away from the technology of the time that it was created in. And I think the origin of this aesthetic would be Blade Runner for most people. And of course, Ghost in the Shell is another classic. I would date Blade Runner as the exact shifting period between retrofuturism and cyberpunk. Of course, it's not strict. It's just an interpretation. You're open to take it. If not, you can throw it away. That's not a problem. It's just a theory. And the reason I say it's a theory, and the reason I say it's the teenage edgier version of retrofuturism, is because it not only gives you the technological visual of what the future will look like, but it also shows you the late capitalism that the future might come with. It also is a genre that directly is associated with asking the larger questions, as in, what does it mean to have a soul? What does it mean to have an identity? Who is allowed to have an identity? Are technocracies moral? Are technocracies allowed to exist? Why are we building them around us? Is all technology good? And of course, Blade Runner is a timeless classic. Again, Ridley Scott's work. And he teamed up with Philip K. Dick on that one, which is even more brilliant. He's one of my favorite authors of all time. And Ridley Scott and Philip K. Dick managed to separate retrofuturism from cyberpunk in Blade Runner specifically, because I feel like when I was watching the movie, as time-bound as the characters were in the movie, all of them were allowed a lot of individuality, and you could see that in them. However, the true marking birth of the cyberpunk aesthetic came to me in a Japanese movie titled Tetsuo the Iron Man. It's a future where a man runs over another man with a car and slowly but surely turns into a machine or rubble. And of course, the movie is more of a Kafkaesque nightmare where you're powerless in front of turning into a machine. It's like Metamorphosis, but for gears and clocks. But I felt like visually it distinguished itself from retrofuturism into something we identify as anxiety about technology. And then the most popular and the most influential anime when it comes to cyberpunk came along, which is Ghost in the Shell. And that defined the end of retrofuturism as we understand it, and the beginning of cyberpunk as a continuation of retrofuturism from now on. And I mean that strictly in terms of pop culture. I do not mean to make any claims about aesthetic continuation or survival of subgenres. Of course, retrofuturism very much exists, and I think cassette futurism also very much exists. I don't need to be educated about their existence. I just mean their influence in popular culture might be reduced and it might be taken over by something else. Mamoto Oshii's commitment to bringing a surreal existential style to a scary and unfamiliar land of technology in this series was brilliant. And the questions it asked about implications of mixing of man and machine sort of defined most movies that came forward. For example, Matrix is directly influenced from Ghost in the Shell. And as time moved forward, specifically from 1995 to forward, because 1995 is when Ghost in the Shell comes out as an anime, it also gave a certain sense of security to the neoliberal globalized world. At least culturally, a lot of writers were assuming that the influence of socialism and communism was in the past, and all definite futures were a depiction of late capitalism, and all depictions that were not of late capitalism were alternate futures. An example of the same would be something like A Man in the High Castle, a book that went on to actually inspire Wolfenstein, the game. And I genuinely recommend Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. It's one of my favorite games played last decade. The book itself is written by Philip K. Dick, again, who is one of my favorite writers. But we were talking about cyberpunk. The reason cyberpunk became a grim reality to look forward to is because we ended up bolting towards capitalism being the brutal but the last best option. And slowly but surely, we sort of see the overlap between cyberpunk themes and how controlling the means of communication such as social media today gives you immense amounts of power and immense amounts of responsibility, which is very easily misused, which means the means of communication are centralized, privacy is dying, our anxieties about the future from the past. And hence, cyberpunk became one of the most relevant things to talk about. It just happens to be a coincidence or, a stroke of genius that Cyberpunk 2077 comes out in 2020. But it also addresses aesthetically and thematically our greatest anxieties as a people. Of course, I mean that beyond the global pandemic, don't get me wrong. But I would argue even the pandemic played into our cyberpunk-ish anxieties, because it propelled us into something we've discussed before as one of the places of practice that we should actually imagine to be some of the best infinite real estate, which is cyberspace. Anokhi Shah was on the podcast who talked about it. Now, I don't want to undo what Anokhi's done on the podcast here. Anokhi was actually brilliant at relaxing some of the anxieties around cyberspace and looking at the potential of the thing, but also I have to address the anxieties because that's what we're talking about. Cyberspace and our inculcation into it as a people has been seen to be the first step towards a technocracy by literally every science fiction author that has existed. And one of the best quotes that I came across today in the research about this episode that you almost didn't hear was about cyberspace. The book Neuromancer defines cyberspace as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation. And of course, they probably mean either the way we conduct classes today because of the pandemic or, gaming lobbies, Discord chats, what have you. But you know what? As grim as that quote is, I don't want to end on that note. I don't want you to feel anxious every time you use a screen. I don't want to tell you how less you should use a screen because I think you should be able to gauge that for yourself by now. We've sort of stepped into the cyber reality halfway in anyway, and there is a way to make this work. We've had guests that have talked about it before, that how this can be made to work. But what I do want you to take away from this episode is learn about the anxieties and learn about the achievements that people who came before us made to show us a picture of what our lives would look like to them. Just by virtue of experience of time shared as being of the same species, and maybe at least get used to some of the anxieties, if not all of them. Okay, that's all I have for you this week. After I recorded this episode and while I was editing it, I realized that this was actually a better suited title for a video essay. But Kernatron has done such a good video essay that I have been actively demotivated to make another video essay on YouTube about it. And so you have the podcast episode. But beyond all that, if you still like the episode, please go to YouTube and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit a like if you're watching this on YouTube already. On any other platforms, please stay tuned. If you really like the episode, please consider going to Patreon and supporting this podcast financially. Any bit helps out, really, and makes it easier for me to dedicate time to this podcast. And if you go down in the description, you will also find an Instagram post link, which is practically all the merch we offer under the Deep Fried Neurons banner, which also helps support the channel if that's the way you want to support it, a one-time thing. And I would like to go on the record to advise you to stay cheeky breaky, my gender neutral appropriate terms.